Welcome back. This is the second lecture for the sixth week of Disciples, History, and Polity. Again, I'm here with Shonda Jha, who wrote the book Room at the Table, and she is going to continue our lecture for this week.
Thanks a lot. I mentioned in passing in the book this concept of the white man's burden. Rudyard Kipling was a famous British poet who wrote a poem about the obligation in the 1900s, the obligation of white people to bring civilization to the savages in other parts of the world. And that ethos was very much a part of the work of very well-intentioned people within every part of American society in those days, and the disciples were no exception to that rule. Daisy Machado is a famous disciples historian who is of Latina descent, and she talks about the ways in which our denomination engaged Mexicans in America, Chicanos, versus the way the denomination dealt with Mexicans in Mexico and dealt with Puerto Ricans. And the relationship is very complicated when you're using that white man's burden framework. If the understanding is we have an obligation to civilize those people, it becomes much more difficult to navigate when those people were here first. And so the mission work or the ministries of partnership with Mexican Americans in the United States in the 19th century were very harried, were very rough edged, were done with a great deal of ambivalence by the Anglo disciples because it was difficult to figure out how to negotiate this relationship with people who are them but are also us. It was a much cleaner thing to do mission work to those people in another country, in Mexico or Puerto Rico, where we remain a very vital ministry force. The relationship in places like Texas, however, were much more complicated and continue to be complicated. And yet, those complications often emerge with some really glorious moments. One of my favorite stories that I think I've ever heard is from a colleague of mine in Indianapolis. She's a Puerto Rican disciple, and she said, you know, back when the disciples were first missionizing in Puerto Rico, they found out that our churches were doing all sorts of high energy worship with dancing and praising and hands in the air. And there's a letter at the Historical Society from the United Christian Missionary Society to the Disciples of Christ in Puerto Rico saying, unless you stop this raucous, inappropriate dancing, which is not of God, then we will have to remove our funding. Because remember, the disciples in our denomination were functioning out of the white man's burden. They were trying to civilize people, not just bring them Christianity, but bring them the dignity of white Christianity. And according to this colleague of mine, the letter that the disciples in Puerto Rico wrote back to the UCMS was, you keep your money, we'll keep the Holy Spirit. And so there's this element of, we recognize how great God and Christ and the Holy Spirit are in our lives, but we don't necessarily have to do it in exactly the same way. Now, it's kind of a snarky comment to hear if you're on the receiving end of it, but over the course of our history, that has been some of what has been beautiful about our denomination, is those kinds of interactions often lead to exchanges of great gifts. One of my favorite things about being in this region is there are so many different ways in which we share God's love, and there are so many different ways in which we share that with one another. I'm in a congregation that shares a building with the Mongolian congregation, and the ways in which they worship and we worship can actually be a blessing to one another. It's part of what's great about being disciples. I've heard, and at the same time, we still sometimes hear this question of or we still sometimes hear this idea that there is a way of being disciples. And the question I often hear when people are talking about new churches, particularly new racial ethnic churches, is, but are they disciples enough? Which usually means, do they behave in a dignified way? And do they take communion every week?
Mm-hmm.
Do they follow those unwritten rules that we have about what it means to be disciples? And our regional minister to the north, Kathy Myers-Wirt in Oregon, says, I worship in a lot of new churches, and I find that they are more disciples than some of the traditional churches I worship with because they share the news of Jesus Christ's love in the world, and because they practice full inclusion of people, and because they minister to people who are on the margins. And Kathy said, there's a lot of things about being disciples that some of our traditional churches struggle to do.
Mm-hmm.
We can actually learn from our new, passionate, vital disciples churches. And maybe they'll learn from us how to take communion every week.
Hmm.
It might be a fair exchange of glorious, glorious gifts. One of the questions that I've heard raised, especially by the head of NAPAD, North American Pacific and Asian Disciples, his name is Gunhee Yu, and Dr. Yu asks the question, since 3 of the 4 founders of the disciples were actually immigrants to this country, Barton Stone and the Campbells,
Yes.
what would it look like for us if we thought of ourselves as a denomination made up of immigrants rather than a frontier tradition? When we think of ourselves as a frontier tradition, the white man's burden gets unintentionally embedded in the way we understand our history and, in some ways, our future. But when we think of ourselves as a nation, as a denomination of immigrants, it opens us up to Christ in a different way. It makes us a little more humble in the way we understand our ministry. It makes us a little more sympathetic or empathetic. It allows us to be ministering on the margins in the same way that Jesus did. And some of the stories that I hold most dear in our tradition are stories from immigrant churches. West Adams Christian Church was the very last Japanese American church in our denomination. They were originally the Japanese Christian Institute, which was closed down during World War II. There had been 3 or 4 different Japanese American churches before World War II, and the denomination decided that their goal was integrated churches and multicultural churches. And so West Adams Christian Church kind of fought its way into existence, especially after the traumas of the internment camps that they had gone through. They felt that they needed a community of support. That church just closed its doors recently. It was the final church that had that kind of legacy, which is really, really sad. But the flip side of that story is the building of the Japanese Christian Institute gave birth to All People's Christian Church, which is the model of multicultural, multi-ethnic ministry for this denomination. And it had members who were from the Japanese Christian Institute who returned from the internment camps and said, we want to show the world what a community of love that crosses races can look like. And that's one of my favorite stories from the disciples' history.
And they're in Los Angeles.
They're
yes?
in Los Angeles,
Yes.
exactly. My mentor and pastor, Alvin Jackson, who is the current pastor of another fabulous multi-ethnic, multiracial church in New York City, Park Avenue Christian Church, has often said, we came to this country on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. And the idea of being that denomination that is made up of people from different cultures and different races and different experiences is part of the glory of who the disciples can be.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Shonda. This has been a very helpful and informative time. And I hope our students found it to be so too.
Me too. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right.